Awesome. Well, how's the day going? Good content? Good.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so we wanted to get this group together to talk about containers. So obviously last year here at OpenStack Silicon Valley, containers was the threat of the day or the topic of the day. I think a lot has changed in a year. I spent this morning talking to some reporters about how fast this container revolution really has captured particularly enterprise workloads. I think it's interesting now being part of IBM and the conversations we're having with enterprise buyers. Like in 2 very short years, containers have really penetrated that marketplace in a way that it's taken sort of cloud technologies much longer to do. So I wanted to spend some time talking about how that standardization of what a container is and how a container operates, how that's helping or hurting OpenStack and helping and hurting other parts of the ecosystem. So we'll do a quick round of introductions with each of you, maybe name, company, and what you guys do, and then we'll dive into some questions.
Ken Robertson, lead architect with Apsera. Apsera is a security and policy-focused container platform, and I work on some of the core low-end systems.
Mir Levy, Gigaspace is Cloudify. Cloudify is an orchestration platform. And the headquarters is back in Israel. I'm here representing the CTO office in the Silicon Valley.
Hi, I'm Florian Liebert, and I'm with Mesosphere. And at Mesosphere, we're building the data center operating system. And a big part of the data center operating system is to manage and orchestrate container workloads. So when you have a containerized application, you can scale it out, you can manage it, and we auto-recover it if it fails.
Hi, I'm Andy Randall, CEO at Tigera. We're the company behind Project Calico and the Canal project, securing cloud networks. And we plug into both OpenStack environments as well as Kubernetes and Mesos and a lot of these container environments. So we're right at the heart of that transition and the integration of those worlds.
Awesome, thanks. So we're 10 years in now to real cloud adoption. You go back to 2006 with Amazon. We're probably 8 years into sort of the platform as a service world. And I think it's curious to see now containers, again, sort of 2 or 3 years from the point where you could say Docker kind of started everything. How do you see that the introduction of containers recently changing the adoption rate of platform as a service or of cloud infrastructure in general?
Well, I can take it. I think that the containers really help drive adoption. It provides new efficiencies that could not be achieved. And I think that what customers really see is how dynamic this field is in providing the requirements, which is we want a rapid deployment, we want a rapid integration, we want to figure out how to take advantage into those cloud technologies without being intrusive into their daily lives. So I think containers is just another wonderful tool in getting the job done, and we will see some great innovation down the road. So the question is how do you comprehend all those? And I think some of my other panelists also have some pretty cool technology. And we see that the embrace of the technology is the rapid of being able to embrace the technology also accelerates. So I think that and you can see the growth in Kubernetes and how quickly this was caught like fire, and that's all shows that there is a real need for this, and there is a real need in the market and real innovation that's happening in this market.
I think when you look back, containers really were around before Docker was around, right? Like Google should get a lot of credit for really implementing it in the Linux kernel way back. And I joined Twitter in end of 2009, and we looked at a system called Mesos back in the day. And Mesos was a way to orchestrate containers. Well, we containerized the applications without you actually knowing it, right? We were back in the day trying to decompose Ruby on Rails, a monolithic application, to a microservices-based architecture. And all of these microservices were actually JVM-based. And we used the C groups abstraction, which was part of the Linux kernel, a much more lighter weight virtual machine for hypervisor, essentially. We relied on the jar, on jar for our packaging. And it's really interesting to see, because back then we didn't really make a big deal out of containers, but I think what Docker has really done is they've brought this tool to the individual developer, right? So that you can actually use it from your laptop and not just in a large-scale environment. And I think containers are just one of the steps in the evolution of how we deal with IT infrastructure. I think when you look at Amazon, at the Amazon Web Service portfolio, it's kind of the gold standard for what's happening in software-defined infrastructure. And I think containers are just one of the verticals. I think like we are seeing a lot of other verticals that are actually really interesting, like for example, big data processing, NoSQL. And a lot of these technologies will probably be packaged in a container. But I think the container is just part of this evolution. It's not the end of the evolution.
I think you asked specifically about platforms as a service.
Yeah.
And I think one of the interesting things that we've seen happen over the last, I'd say year, maybe even 6 months, is because the original platform as a service solutions were built as vertically integrated stacks, right? What's happened with the orchestration pieces and the scheduling pieces now becoming standardized, the world kind of adopting, particularly Mesos and Kubernetes, right, is that we're seeing the platform as a service solutions being re-architected, and it's breaking apart that stack and creating kind of a differing layers of value within that stack. So when you get something like Red Hat taking OpenShift and embracing Kubernetes at the same time, it's really making clear, well, what is it that Kubernetes is doing? What is it that OpenShift is doing? And we're seeing adoption of all of those platforms, and we're seeing, in particular, we're seeing enterprises both embracing, the orchestration platforms like Kubernetes and Mesos and Docker Swarm, as well as putting PaaSes on top. And I think there'll be a coexistence for some time. And I think the real question, though, is as the scope of Mesos with things like DCOS coming out, building a bigger solution around it, and Kubernetes, all of the ecosystem that's happening there, things like Tectonic from CoreOS, building larger solutions around the core distributions, do they start to become effectively the PaaS of tomorrow? And I think
it's interesting to me. You talk about Ruby on Rails, like you go way back to 06, 08, like Heroku, Engineer, these guys were some of the first innovators in this platform space. And I think one of the challenges there was that to really adopt that technology, you were building to a black box. And you had to be okay with that black box. And as long as you were, then in theory, your application could have pretty significant scalability without having to think about a lot of the operational challenges. Now you fast forward to today, and I think the argument that's being made to a large extent is that the container is a packaging mechanism, and the schedulers and all these other tools now give you a lot of capabilities you used to get out of those platform tools without having to worry about the same black box constraints. And so enterprises, I think, are saying, well, hey, we've got all these legacy applications, and maybe we can use that container as the packaging mechanism. Do you think that, in what way do you think that has changed adoption or utilization of these platform components?
I think in many ways it can be a challenge to it. A lot of the platform as a service kind of came with this approach of the 12-factor app and do's and don'ts that applications must adhere to or whatnot. And legacy applications didn't always follow that. So a lot of them would face a challenge of, okay, do we have to rewrite this application? Or is there some way to pick it up and forklift it onto a platform? And I think that's one thing that hasn't been heavily explored. And you may, back in the VM adoption phase, you saw, physical to VM conversion tools. And you may see something along the same lines around, VM or physical to container. And some of the different platforms now, like Kubernetes, has added pet sets where, you can't treat some of these things as immutable, and you need to give it some kind of special attributes.
I think also one thing that has really changed is, in the past, when you were dealing with Heroku, right, you were completely relying on someone else, and you could never replicate it in your own data center. So there was really this big separation between private cloud and public cloud. And I think today, as a lot of actual enterprises, right, not just the Star Wars the Star Trek convention is the small startups are using these services, as larger enterprise want to embrace those, and you're basically finding yourself in this hybrid cloud environment where you might want to burst out for peak demand into a cloud. You can have a common API, right? And even Amazon doesn't allow you to do that unless you're the US government and you spend $600 million or so to get your AWS-like infrastructure. And I think that's what Kubernetes, what DCOS, Mesos, and a lot of these other technologies really enable you to do. They allow you to run your own hosted PaaS.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So then you fast forward a couple years and you look at the introduction of Cloud Foundry, which was arguably one of the first PaaS implementations that gave you that flexibility to run it anywhere. Yet the original versions of Cloud Foundry were still very much sort of a black box. Like it has to fit into this matrix. Certainly over the last year and a half with Diego and Cloud Foundry, we've seen a lot of changes into how it's processing. But how do you see in this world a technology like Cloud Foundry, which has sort of evolved with the changes in the container ecosystem, compare or contrast to what's going on with Mesos and Kubernetes and comparable offerings?
So I think one of the important things to understand within this context is that as good as a PaaS can be, it's usually very, very opinionated about the infrastructure it's operate over. So we see open standard orchestration like Tosca allowing us to take a step higher in the model and understanding that the underlying application orchestration or tools can be orchestrated together as long as you provide the right modeling and the right understanding and abstractions between those applications. So you can run over public cloud, private cloud, and we can run with different orchestration services. And there's no need to take any one specific technology corner, because whatever you take, and this panel called the next container standard, and we're just living through the first one, right? Or the evolution of the container to the modern cloud world. But clearly there will be some new technologies around the corner. And we must, embrace the understanding that, whatever we see today as a PaaS or as a PaaS platform, it's going to change tomorrow.
I think that's right. I think the Kubernetes, DCOS, these platforms are driving standardization of pieces of the architecture. So, in our space, for example, networking, Kubernetes was the first platform to really push the container network interface CNI plugin mechanism, right? Mesos has since adopted it, and now we're starting to see it filter up into, so for example, Cloud Foundry, have a paper out on the future of networking in Cloud Foundry, and because of what they're seeing happening at those layers, which in some senses are kind of, a layer below them, it's moving up there as well. So I think it's good in the sense that we're seeing more kind of plug and play of different components that can be put together, whether what you need is an infrastructure as a service, container as a service, or something much more opinionated built on top of those constructs.
But do you think these technologies are competitive technologies, or are they complementary? Like if I go look at an enterprise, traditional enterprise developer, they've got thousands of applications, and some of them are as simple as just CRUD applications where I'm submitting my expense report, and some are the front page of an advertising website that can't go down. And each of those has its own unique attributes, right? I think that the smaller applications, the lighter weight applications benefit from developer velocity and that black box approach where they don't have to know anything about the infrastructure. It's just they push the app and away they go. And some other applications, like the front page of some advertising site that needs to be up 100% for the ad revenues, that might be a much more complicated application. Like how do you think about sort of cooperation of these technologies in a customer's environment?
I think what it often boils down to is really religion. I think a lot of these technologies will end up having very similar or even the same capabilities over time. And I think some of them are more opinionated than others. Some of them give you more flexibility than others. And I think it depends what sort of business case you have, which technology you should pick. I think if you really like the way that, for example, Google defines or Google is building applications, then maybe Kubernetes is really the way to go. If you want to have maybe a little bit more flexibility, maybe you choose something else. I think it's, but I think over time you'll find a lot of these features replicated across all of these platforms.
But I think a lot of PaaS differentiation is really just build tooling. You know, you push your code and it takes care of orchestrating it for you, what it needs to connect to, the network, storage, and everything. But I mean, that is really just kind of a segment of it. You build a container from that and a definition for a workload, and then it runs within your infrastructure. The problem with PaaS was it was too opinionated in many cases. You know, we wanted to tweak the network or tweak the database and have it go here instead of there. So I think there's just a spectrum. Some fall over here and some can leverage that. In some cases, it's nice to just push stuff up, but at other times you may want more control and not to give up as much of that.
Yeah, I think it's like they're just development and deployment environments, right? So in the same way that Visual Basic coexisted with C++ and Java for many years with different use cases, and there probably were enterprises where they were building things in C++ that could have been built more quickly and easily in Visual Basic, and vice versa, right? And then it does just come down to religion, but it doesn't mean that they can't all coexist.
Yeah, and by the way, I was more talking about really the container orchestration piece, right? Because I think that's where a lot of overlap is happening right now. So you have Swarm, you have Kubernetes, and you have Marathon and DCOS. They all do container orchestration. They place a container somewhere. They make sure it continues to run. They make sure if one of the containers goes down due to hardware failures, it's resurrected somewhere else. I think it's actually a fairly easy task. I think where it becomes more difficult is when you're adding different types of workloads to a cluster, and you're seeing big data workloads alongside maybe a message queue. So for example, you have Spark running next to Kafka, running next to HDFS, and then on top of that, you want to have containers in order to have your web tier application up there. I think those are more advanced use cases, and those require a different solution than just a container orchestrator. And I think that was, by the way, one of the reasons why we wanted to build DCOS, because that was what we were experiencing at Twitter at the time. When we first used Mesos, we saw a need for not just running one type of application, but multiple classes of workloads, and they all had different SLAs. And that was one of the reasons why we built this system that goes above and beyond just container orchestration.
I also think this is where hybrid becomes a broader thing than just public and private. It's also hybrid across different types of environments within a given type of cloud, and that may be spreading across public and private as well. So, we have a customer who's deployed Calico with OpenStack. They also have some Mesos in-house, and they want to start putting Calico into that. They're also deploying OpenShift, and and they're looking to integrate Calico with that as well, because they want a consistent set of networking and policy across those. And the fact, and I use networking as an example there, but the same could apply to storage. The same could apply to all sorts of different pieces of technology that, because these are now being built in an open environment, can theoretically apply across all of these all of these orchestration environments.
Right. We also see the hybrid stack or the hybrid cloud as being a major use case recently, not just by the emergence of containers, but also the need to move to OpenStack from VMware environment, the need to utilize public cloud, but do it carefully and slowly, and even migration within the same cloud technology between one version of OpenStack to another sometimes requires more than meets the eye. So I definitely agree that all those emergence of all the tools of orchestration is really helping to kind of decouple the opinionated PaaS sometimes to the actual application and their needs.
Well, hybrid is a pretty broad subject too, because even in some cases it might be just a single data center, where like this rack has 10 gig internet or 10 gig Ethernet, or I don't want these bits to touch these bits because this is HIPAA and that's something else. So there's a lot of segmentation where this application can't be by these or those, and you need to separate them.
So if it's a religious decision to some extent, like who's making that decision? Like what is the profile of the individual? Is it your traditional operations teams in these organizations? Is it now the developers that are deciding the platform they want to use and helping push that? Like where, in your experience with the companies you're part of, who's making the decision on which platform to adopt?
We see it a lot within like the developers themselves making these calls, right? And then at some point it needs to be consolidated and someone needs to make a call, or companies actually end up using multiple platforms at the same time. I think that's also pretty common. That's what we see.
No, so we work a lot with cloud architecture teams, so companies where they are trying to build an internal cloud for the developers, internal developers as their customers. But those developers place significant demands on, as internal customers. And one of the most common demands, obviously, is they're building for Docker. So Docker is kind of the lingua franca that crosses all of these systems. They're coming and they're saying, we've built an app for Docker, and I don't care how you run this thing, but whatever cloud you're building, it's got to be able to take Docker packaged workloads. So that migration from development environment into production environment, and how that happens, and the interaction and power play between developers versus ops teams is, that's going to be a big part of what determines what actually gets deployed.
Yeah, because I see a lot with developers coming in, but the operations team or the security team, they're looking at like, well, where did this container come from? How do I know what's in it? How do I track that? And a lot of time it's convincing them, convincing, but also giving tools to kind of audit, measure, and manage that, so they don't kind of have to let go of their infrastructure, but can still maintain their responsibilities.
Let's not forget another very important OpenStack vertical, which is the telcos. We seen AT&T here, and we know and we understand how important is the emergence of NFV technologies. So in their world, the apps becomes VNFs. But those VNFs, it's even becomes a little bit more complex, because now the actual customers and users are influencing what VNF decision do they need to incorporate. How do you catalog them? How do you blueprint them? How do you incorporate them into running services? And over there, there is a new kind of consumer, but I think that and containers is again another way of being able to provide a micro-segmentation of some of those network fields that badly required to reach scale for NFV. So among those all, for them it's not just a hybrid cloud, it's a hybrid world that's the customers are living in, and they need to provide those services.
Awesome. So I want to pivot real quickly and talk about foundations, because I think we've certainly got a plethora of them nowadays. We got OpenStack, we got Cloud Foundry, we got cloud native computing, we've got Open Container Initiative. We've got plenty of foundations that are involved in various aspects of this world. How do those foundations help or hurt this ecosystem, and what do you think? What's the biggest benefit we'll see from them over the next couple of years? Particularly as we think of like container standard.
I think a lot of it will become vendors being able to build against something that's stable. Everyone here is working with containers in some way, and they all need to kind of have an understanding that what works today will not be broken in 6 months or 12 months, and that their own dependencies or their own products can evolve with it.
Well, I think that what we see with those foundation is how technology, and especially a good technology, becomes much bigger than even the company that pushed it initially. And we've seen those debates with Docker and the Docker community, going beyond the Docker Hub. And I think that's an important progression that the customers are watching. And they want to make sure that even an open source, what starts as an open source doesn't stay locked into a certain company or certain developer community. So they get much more option and much more choice.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, of course, that foundations bring developers, regardless of their professional affiliation, together, making sure that some standards are created so that big enterprises can actually bet on the technology, and even if the company behind the technology gets bought, you still have the technology stick around. And I think actually the best example for that is probably the Apache Foundation, right? It's really transformed the way that open source is now used within large enterprises.
Yeah, I've had large enterprises suddenly say to us, you know, we're okay starting to adopt this technology, but if, you know, at some point we absolutely need to see this migrate into a foundation. So I think the savvier enterprises don't just look for an open source stamp, they're actually looking for a foundation stamp as a guarantee of long-term stability, and they're also looking for the community of contributors around projects.
Which is interesting though, right? Because a foundation's, one of the primary jobs there, it creates sort of the community around something, but the foundation itself is not writing any of the code or maintaining the project, right? At the end of the day, it's the same engineering organizations that were doing that work prior that are still there. So it's an interesting question.
But the governance models is really important, right?
Yeah.
Because, you know, if you just have an open source, then, you know, the same risks that as using a closed source, you know, still exist. With a foundation, and, you know, the way Linux and Apache are running those foundations, and having those bylaws and transparency really helps, you know, get more confidence into those products.
Yeah, if you look at the entry criteria for something like Apache Software Foundation, you know, or they have an incubation period, and the exit criteria for that incubation period is you have to demonstrate that there's sufficient community momentum around the project, and it's not just sponsored by one company. So I think that's one of the things that foundations, you know, look for before they're going to take a project in. And I know Cloud Native Computing Foundation has the same philosophy as well. They want to see that it's got, you know, adoption beyond the initial home that it started in.
And I mean, community doesn't always mean everyone in that community is BFFs. Sometimes tension within a community is just highlighting things that still need to be resolved in order to move the standard forward.
All right, so we're gonna end here with a two-part question. First part's a pretty simple part, then we're gonna go into the second part. If you look at the container ecosystem of all of the startups that are involved in this space, how much money do you think has currently been invested in that in the last 2 years? Invested in companies involved in this space.
Is this like you know the answer and it's, we're
I
getting
don't know.
which of us gets closest?
I think it really depends where you draw the boundaries of what's...
Just make a guess.
10 billion.
10 billion?
$1 billion.
$1 billion. I was thinking $1 billion.
Yeah, so I think my guess was 750 to about $1 billion bucks. So now, which is a ton of money. And we've got that floating around in a huge number of companies, many of which are involved in open source projects that now are part of foundations. How do you think the need to commercialize what each one of these companies has built and to build sustainable businesses that then return the investors money off of that $1 billion bucks, how does that impact sort of the standardization of the containers, the fact that we've got a bunch of, as you mentioned, a bunch of these platforms that are now building similar sets of capabilities, and how does that shape business models for these types of companies going forward? I think this to me is one of the most interesting questions of the open source world right now, is how do these companies that are involved in open source return the capital that's been put into them to help? Because without that $1 billion bucks, quite frankly, we wouldn't have a lot of the capabilities that we have.
I think it's about really trying to find good use cases and trying to build out real solutions. I mean, a container is just a technology, right? It's not too different than what we had, as I mentioned, 10 years ago, even before that with Solaris Zones. But I think what you have right now is you can build higher level systems that kind of that use some of these primitives, and containers one of these primitives, in order to really drive business value. And what's the business value? Well, it's that you can deploy an application much quicker, faster time to market. You have better utilization, so you decrease your operational cost. In general, when you use a lot of these technologies, you don't have to have as many servers. You don't have to buy as much VMware-based infrastructure. So those are all business values, and I think the companies that can really package solutions around those are going to be the companies that will manage to be very profitable and run a successful business.
Yeah, at the end of the day, open source technology is technology. It's not usually a packaged solution of the sort that mainstream enterprises are going to be able to just take and adopt without in-house engineering expertise. The early adopters have that kind of in-house engineering expertise and become collaborators in the community. But as these technologies go mainstream, that's where value can be created by the companies that can take the technology and make it consumable. And that's, so when we're in that early stage of working with early adopters, kind of pre-chasm, it's not always obvious where that value is going to be created, but there's always going to be opportunity for creating that value. It's not always going to be the people who originally came up with the technology, though, right? And I also see the VCs. Some of them get that more than others. So we just completed a funding round, and we have very different perspectives from different potential investors. And one of the reasons we liked the investors that we went with was that they really pushed back on our business model, saying, look, you shouldn't be trying to commercialize too early, because you need to make sure that you're actually building a sustainable and viable open source project and community, and without that you can't then go commercialize. I think, and not all the VCs viewed it in the same way. So I think there'll be some investors who are disappointed because they haven't understood what it is they're really investing in.
Awesome. Any closing words?
I think adoption is the best way to commercialize. If you just make your software and nobody uses it, you're not going to sell it for nothing. So the term is sometimes free software, but I think enterprises, telcos, they all understand that the business model is shifting, and the how you exactly monetize, is it through services, through licensing, through higher level system integrators? It's all up to the open, still to see. But I think it's clear that the technology, in terms of shifting a lot of hardware investment into software investment, and that's a positive shift, and it allows companies like Intel and ARM to focus on building the best hardware platform, and software companies and middleware and PaaS platforms to flourish and provide the next generation services.
Well, perfect. Well, with that, we'll hand it back to Joe. Thanks so much for your thoughts on the panel, and go from there.